This conference will now be recorded.
Good evening. Today is Friday, April 10th, and I wanted to take this Good Friday as an opportunity to talk a little bit about the 7 last words of Jesus Christ. We are living in a different time, a time of panic and pandemic and concerns and fears that are overwhelming the hearts and minds of many people, even those who call themselves Christians. But perhaps there is no greater time than this to reflect upon the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, and specifically the impact his words had that he offered us from the cross. His first word comes from the Gospel according to Luke, the 23rd chapter, the 34th verse. He says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." It is perhaps most appropriate that Jesus begins with forgiveness. Even in the midst of his own trial and suffering and sorrow, what was first and foremost on his mind was the forgiveness of those he loved. Perhaps what is so unique about his character and separates him from so many of the rest of us is that despite being tormented and tortured, despite being abused and mishandled, despite his poor treatment, he still carried a large level of concern for the very people who were doing him harm. And it is out of that concern that he offers this word of forgiveness. His example is a call to us. It is a call to you and a call to me. It is a reminder that no matter what we have done, he is ready and willing to forgive. But it is also a challenge. For how can we accept the forgiveness of Christ if we are not willing to? I've seen recently many posts online of people who have been complaining about others going to the stores and buying too much, taking too many rolls of toilet paper, too much hand sanitizer. And what has been evident in those posts is not merely the frustration that people feel when others don't care or show little concern for their neighbors, but also how much frustration those who wrote the posts are experiencing themselves. Without getting into the politics of whether or not the posts are right or wrong, I will suggest this, that even if you're right sometimes, even if you've done nothing wrong, even if you can't find any reasonable justification for the behavior of someone else, perhaps there's a lesson in the concern that Christ shares. Forgiveness has never been about worthiness. Christ doesn't forgive or seek forgiveness just for those who've earned it. And perhaps the greatest lesson we can learn from this word that Christ spoke on the cross is that even when the world has let us down, we are challenged to forgive. The second word that Christ offers from the cross also comes from the gospel according to Luke, the 23rd chapter and the 43rd verse. I assure you, today you will be with me in paradise. Many who read this see it as a companion to the first word, because it also seems to speak about forgiveness. The story, as you will remember, is of two thieves who are hung on crosses on either side of Jesus Christ on the day that he is crucified. Each of them are guilty of crimes unlike Jesus. Each of them have been sentenced to death for what they have legitimately done, unlike Jesus. But one of them decides, even in his suffering and even in his own agony, to mock Jesus, to point and ridicule and laugh at Jesus, despite knowing he is innocent. While the other thief acknowledges him, sees Jesus for who he is, and right there from the cross, at perhaps his lowest moment, believes in him. There are several things that are remarkable about this tale, but one that is often overlooked is that the Jesus that this thief came to believe in was not the Jesus of power and miracle, but the Jesus of sacrifice and love. Perhaps any of us could accept a Jesus Christ who walks on water or turns water into wine or heals the sick or raises the dead, because in that there is manifest power. And that's who we know God to be: power and healing and transformation and deliverance. But this thief doesn't see that this day. He sees a man on a cross, suffering for something he has not done, being persecuted by people he has not wronged, and seeking their forgiveness because of his love. It is because of that extraordinary vision that this thief shows that Jesus turns to him and says, "Today you will be with me in paradise." What a remarkable testimony that thief had, and what a remarkable challenge it is for us. Can you see God for more than his power? For love. The third word, can you see him? The third comes from the love. Third gospel according to John, the 19th. Dear woman, here is your son. Despite the torture and torment that Jesus is suffering, despite the predicament he now finds himself in, hanging on a cross, nails penetrating his hands and feet, he looks down and sees his mother. And if we can imagine for a moment, all of the thoughts that run through his head are not mere thoughts of his own comfort and his own provision and his own pain, but instead thoughts of his mother's care. And so, even now, he looks after her care, speaking to his beloved disciple. He tells him that his mother, Jesus' mother, is now his. This is a great call from Jesus Christ to the responsibility of human relationship. We are not put here to simply go about living our lives in isolation, living in this time, in this day and age where we are trapped, as some have described it, in a house, often with the people we are supposed to be most concerned about and show the most care for. It can be easy to lose sight of the fact that every person in your life you were given for a reason. And we are in each other's care. There is no doubt that Jesus is watching out for us in much the same way that he continued to watch out for Mary long after the tales of this story had ended. But nevertheless, there was still opportunity for John to care for her as well. And the same is true of all of us. How are you caring for your loved ones? How are you caring for your neighbors? How are you caring for the people that God has entrusted you with? These are your daughters. These are your sons. These are your mothers. These are your fathers. These are your people. The fourth word is perhaps the most challenging word. It comes from the Gospel of Mark, the 15th chapter and the 34th verse. Most often it is cited in Aramaic, where it says, Ila, Ila, lama sabachthani, or roughly translated, my God, why have you abandoned me? We can't fully understand what Jesus lost in that moment. What it felt like to be God, to have power and authority over everything, and then into that moment to feel abandoned. Part of our human experience is that every now and then, those who call themselves the sons and daughters of God will realize that everything we ask God to do or plead for God to do doesn't always go according to our plan. We wonder sometimes when God doesn't respond how we'd like. What did we do wrong? Why isn't God performing? Why doesn't God change this? Why doesn't God fix that? Has God abandoned me? In difficult moments, it can be difficult to find the words that provide comfort. But perhaps it is helpful to remember Jesus Christ on the cross. This moment, these words, as evidence that even while his son had to suffer, there was always a plan. Out of experience is that when things are not going our way, that something has been derailed, something has gone off course, something is not as it should be, when the reality is that many of the times our blessing, our opportunity, our joy, our moment is down a path that is riddled with challenges and frustrating moments and even pandemics. And we will not realize until we get to the end that we were never abandoned. It was always just part of the plan. The fifth word comes from the book of John, the 19th chapter, 28th verse. It says simply, I am thirsty. Personally, this is one of my favorite words because it speaks to the humanity of Jesus Christ. Christ thirsts. In this moment, he struggles with perhaps the most human of challenges. His body craves sustenance. He desires water. Many of the greatest mistakes that human beings have ever made have come out of our human desires. And while they serve a very practical purpose because the body does long for the nourishment it needs to thrive and survive, it often provides opportunities for us to do the wrong thing, to go the wrong place, to say the wrong words. But in this moment, Christ does not. He is thirsty, weakened perhaps by dehydration, struggling in his body, but nevertheless, still working the plan. Perhaps the greatest lesson in that is simply that everything that we want to accomplish, everything we are trying to do, will not be easy. And if we are not careful, then the natural tendencies and needs and desires of our flesh can derail us. But if we stay focused, the thirst will pass. And whether we can see it or not, the plan will be fulfilled. As it is in the sixth word, comes from the Gospel of John, the 19th chapter and the 30th verse. It says simply, "It is finished." If we will take a moment to step back and remember what he endured. These days, folks are complaining because they've been trapped in the house for 3 weeks, because they can't go to the grocery store and get enough eggs, because the milk is running low, because authorities are asking them to be patient and wait, because sometimes they have to wear face masks, because fear is overtaking the world around them. But if we remember for a moment what he endured, if we don't gloss over what he went through in this moment, the torture, the bloodshed, the beatings, the spear in his side, the crown of thorns upon his head, the trial, the ridicule, the weight of that heavy cross on his back. If we put ourselves for just a moment in his place, then we realize that all of the sufferings and all of the challenges that we are going through, they don't compare. Especially when we remember that he did all of that, not for himself, but for you. The truth is, we've all been in situations where we couldn't wait for it to be over. Perhaps we're in one right now. For days, to some sense of what we once had, and we can all cry out with a universal or a global, "It is finished." The coronavirus is finished. The isolation is finished. The quarantine is finished. I can relate. The sense of satisfaction, knowing that it is complete, can provide a peace and a joy that is unmatched. But what is so powerful about these words, probably what makes them more significant than simply the end of a pandemic, is what he accomplished. "It is finished" didn't simply signal that the waiting was over. It did not simply signify a chance to go back to what was normal. It did not simply mean that everything was going to be all right now. It meant that all of your burdens and all of your sins and all of the things that you had done wrong and all of the problems that you had created and all of the times that you went the wrong way or said the wrong word or led someone down the wrong path and all of the chances that you had to get it right and failed to do it. It meant that he took all of those burdens and took responsibility for all of those flaws. And completed the story of all of our lives. Not with the perpetual death that we had earned, but with life more abundantly. The seventh word, Father, I entrust my spirit into your hands. This comes from the Gospel of Luke, the 23rd chapter and the 46th verse. There's a lot to like about the phrasing here. The first and most obvious thing is that it depicts Christ's control. In some of your scriptures, some of your Bibles, it will say he gave up the ghost. He surrendered the spirit. Whatever your interpretation says, it implies that Christ had a measure of control over when and how the spirit departed his body. Which just goes to show you that all along the way, he had a choice. A choice to suffer, a choice to be beaten, a choice to be bruised, a choice to be tortured, a choice to be hung on a cross, a choice that he made on our behalf. He chose to surrender his life. He chose to go through torment and torture. He chose to do it because he realized that the only way that we could have salvation, the only way that we could be righteous enough or worthy enough, the only way that we could receive some measure of the promise of paradise for all eternity was if he made the choice he did. But also included in those words are the sentiment of surrendering his life into the hands of God the Father. There are many that are consumed with worry, especially right now. They worry about what will happen next. They worry about how this whole thing will unfold. They worry about how we will put the pieces back together. They worry about how we can reconstruct what we have lost. But for the Christian heart, there should not be so much concern. Because all of that reconstruction, all of that putting things back together, all of that making it whole again, all of that finding our way back to normalcy is happening in the same safe space. The hands of God. For if you believe that you are saved, if you understand relationship with Christ, if you have surrendered your heart to him, then right now, this day, just like every day before, you have been living in his protection. You have been thriving in his hands. So what are you worried about? If Christ could surrender his spirit into the hands of God after such a difficult death, what's a little pandemic gonna do? This pandemic is frightening for so many, but it need not be for believers, because we must always remember whose hands we are in. And as long as we are in God's hands, he is in control. And I promise you that there is no part of this, no portion, no partition of it that he didn't know was coming. As Paul wrote, neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor demons, neither our fears of today, nor our worries about tomorrow, not even the powers of hell can separate us from God's love. So I encourage you to remember, no matter how many days this pandemic continues, no matter how challenging it may become, we're okay as long as we're in God's hands. And as long as we always remember we are good because we are loved. I hope you enjoy Easter service and you find the peace that passes all understanding in your fellowship with Him. God bless.